Franklin. James, thank you so much for having us a few minutes.
My pleasure.
James, this week we have important meeting. The Federal Reserve will publish its decision in monetary policy. The ECB last week raised rates more than it had promised at its pre-O meeting and did not provide guidance for the size of next month's increase. Now, Jerome Powell has a particular stake, we could say, in making sure markets don't under or overestimate what is coming now. This week's rate hike will lift the Fed policy rate to what policymakers say a neutral level, and further increases in borrowing costs are expected to bite into economic growth and eventually inflation as well. What should we expect from tomorrow?
I think a 75 basis point hike is very much the likely outcome from a policy perspective. When we saw the latest CPI print, and that was another positive surprise, at least an upside surprise, the market quite quickly moved to price 100 basis points for this meeting. Very quickly, some of the known hawks who have been the best guides to future Fed policy, by that I mean really Christopher Waller and James Bullard, they both quite quickly poured cold water on the idea that they were expecting to vote for 100 basis point hikes. So I think 75 basis points, I think I agree with you completely. The Fed doesn't want to give the market any reason to over or underprice future tightening from this point. We're at a tricky, uncertain inflection in the inflation outlook, and we are seeing the economic data weaken materially. The Fed needs to be careful. So I think Jerome Powell is going to try and say very little. I think he wants to get 75 done and roughly keep market pricing where it is, which is 50, 25, 25 for the three meetings for the rest of this year.
James, you say, I think Powell will try to say very little. So we can think that Powell will play the same role as Lagarde last week.
Well, I mean, the ECB had a communication challenge of its own making. As an institution, they have long espoused the notion that they don't pre-commit. And then in recent months, they seemed to pre-commit to 25 and then 50 in the July and September meetings. And then, much like the Fed did before its June meeting, a story appeared in the press suggesting that 50 basis points was possible in July, which is what we subsequently got. At this stage, if we haven't, and by we I mean financial markets, commentators, observers, if we haven't learned by now that forward guidance is not a productive way to set monetary policy, then I really despair, to be honest. But the ECB's challenge was of its own making, and I think they've recognized that at a period of such incredible uncertainty in data, in gas supplies, geopolitics, to try and forward commit to policy steps is just idiotic in the extreme. And so I think they've recognized that and moved back to a more data contingent and meeting by meeting stance. I think ultimately that's what the Fed will be doing. How explicit that communication from Jerome Powell is remains to be seen. Again, I think he would be quite happy if market pricing for September, November and December remained unchanged by the time his meeting has finished tomorrow.
It's a really challenging situation right now. James, President Joe Biden said he doesn't think the US will go into a recession. The second quarter GDP will be published this Thursday, and we will consider really this data because it could mark a technical recession, as we know. What can we expect?
It's interesting that the economic consensus, certainly as reported by Bloomberg, suggests economists expect positive growth of 0.5%. The Atlanta Fed runs a nowcast, which uses all available data to try and predict the official GDP print. And that is suggesting a number very similar to the one we saw in the first quarter, which was negative 1.6%. My impression of the data journey that we've been on in the last 3 months or so suggests that the latter, a negative number, is more likely. And as you say, that would satisfy the definition of technical recession. I think most of us work on the premise that really the labour market is the core of the economic cycle, and a recession is a phenomenon which occurs when unemployment rises, and obviously that has a pernicious and self-fulfilling negative impact on economic activity. We're not quite there yet. Certainly the official unemployment rate remains at the lows in the US, but when I look at some of the more real-time indicators, including initial jobless claims, it's quite clear to me that there is already a trend of employment weakening, and that's where the recession will come from. So I think on balance, we probably get a negative print on Thursday. In reality, I think by Q4 of this year, we're probably going to look and feel like we're very much in a recession in the US and elsewhere.
And how it would be, this recession? We could talk about a soft recession or a harder recession.
Yeah, I think as some others in the financial markets have done in recent days, I would observe commentary around a soft landing or a shallow recession as being based on hope rather than analysis or expectation. Really, it occurs to me that this is a very, very nasty cocktail of economic forces that we must deal with. And one of the things which has been true and increasingly true in the last decade or more is that we have relied far too heavily on debt and debt growth to generate economic growth, and therefore economies have become far more interest rate sensitive. And so at a time where inflation is high and higher than wage growth, and yet interest rates are going up quite rapidly, I struggle to see how an economy could exhibit a shallow recession type quality without the usual driver of shallow recessions, which is significant policy easing. I'm not sure the inflation picture will soften sufficiently and quickly enough to allow the Fed to ease policy again as soon as the market is pricing at the moment, and as soon as I think would be needed to try and land on that very narrow strip that we call a soft landing.
And James, finally, we've known that the US consumer confidence drops to its lowest level since February last year, as inflation still is biting. What does this data suggest us?
Yeah, so there's a bit of divergence, and it's easy to explain. The University of Michigan Confidence Survey has been declining dramatically over the last number of months, and that's at incredibly low and distressed levels. The questions asked in that survey are towards how wealthy people feel, how much money in their pocket, and given the cost of living crisis that we are all experiencing and observing, it's unsurprising that that survey has declined so quickly. The Conference Board survey, which we've seen this afternoon just 30 minutes or so ago, that asks questions more related to job security in the labour market. And as I noted, the labour market has remained strong until very recently. So again, I think we can count the decline that we are now seeing in the Conference Board survey as another indicator that the labour market is beginning to soften, and this will begin to have a deleterious effect on economic activity.
James Athey, thank you so much for this analysis. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Nosotros nos quedamos con este análisis por parte de James Athey.